You don't notice it all at once. There isn't a clear moment where someone crosses a line and you decide something is wrong. It begins quietly, almost politely. A pause that lingers after you finish speaking. A message that gets answered later than it used to. A plan that changes without much explanation. Each moment is small enough to dismiss, easy to excuse, and simple to overlook. At first, you explain it away. You assume people are tired, distracted, overwhelmed by their own lives. You tell yourself you're reading too much into it. You remind yourself of the good moments, the laughs, the history, and you use them to soften the present. That habit feels reasonable. It feels calm. It feels like maturity. But slowly the pattern starts to form. You notice how often you are the one adjusting. You wait longer. You listen more. You make space so others don't have to. Your time becomes flexible by default. Your needs become optional. Nothing about this feels openly hostile, which makes it harder to name. There's no confrontation to respond to, no moment that demands action. What stays with you isn't anger. It's a quiet sense of imbalance, a feeling that something is slightly off, even when everything looks fine on the surface. You carry that feeling with you through the day, and you don't talk about it. You just notice it growing more familiar. It settles gently, like background noise you stop questioning but never truly stop hearing. Over time, being kind begins to feel different. Not worse, just heavier. What once flowed naturally now carries a faint tension beneath it. You still show up the same way, still listen, still give, but something inside you notices the effort more clearly than before. You become aware of how often you're anticipating other people's needs, how quickly you smooth things over, how easily you say yes before checking how you feel. None of this comes from fear. It comes from care, from a quiet desire to keep things gentle, to avoid creating discomfort for anyone else. But kindness was never meant to feel like exposure. When every soft response invites more weight, you begin to sense the cost. You start choosing words more carefully, not to be honest, but to be safe. You feel a subtle hesitation before offering help, followed by guilt for hesitating at all. What confuses you is that no one asked you to give this much. There was no request, no agreement, no moment of consent. It just became expected. And because you were the one offering, it feels unfair to question it now. So you don't. You keep being kind. You just notice that it doesn't land the same way anymore. It doesn't return to you. It simply leaves you slightly more open than before. That awareness stays close. Late at night, when the world quiets down, the question you avoid during the day drifts closer. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It shows up as a feeling in your chest, a pause in your thoughts, a sense that something is unbalanced. You think back to moments that felt small at the time, a joke that landed a little sharp, a favor that was assumed rather than asked for, a conversation where your silence felt expected. You don't accuse anyone. You don't defend yourself either. You just observe. Part of you wonders if this is simply how things are, if closeness always comes with a cost, if being open automatically means being available. These thoughts don't scare you. They just linger. They sit beside you while you stare at the ceiling, breathing slowly, listening to the quiet. What makes the question uncomfortable is how reasonable it sounds. Am I being valued, or am I being used? There's no dramatic answer waiting for you, no sudden clarity, just the awareness that something important deserves your attention. You don't rush to resolve it, you let it exist. And in that stillness, you begin to sense that this question isn't new at all. It's simply been waiting for enough silence to finally be heard. You remain still, allowing the thought to settle without pressure or urgency tonight, alone.
There's a way warmth moves through people that doesn't rely on words. You don't announce it, you don't plan it. It comes from how you listen without interrupting, how you remember details others forget, how you make space without being asked. To you, it feels natural. It feels like being present. But presence has a shape, and others can feel it even when they don't consciously notice it. You might think of yourself as open or understanding or simply attentive. You respond thoughtfully. You give people time to finish their thoughts. You don't rush to protect your own position. None of this feels like an invitation. It feels like decency. Yet over time, this quiet openness begins to communicate something unintended. It tells the world that you are available, that you can hold more, that you won't push back right away. People respond to this instinctively, not because they're cruel, but because humans move toward what feels safe and accommodating. When someone senses that you won't resist, won't challenge, won't withdraw easily, they lean in. They take up more space. They speak longer. They bring more of themselves into the interaction, often without noticing how little room they leave behind. At first, it feels fine. You don't mind listening. You don't mind adjusting. You might even feel useful in these moments, needed. There's a quiet satisfaction in being the one who can handle things, the one who stays calm, the one who doesn't make situations heavier than they already are. But gradually, something shifts. You notice that the exchange isn't balanced anymore, not because anyone decided it shouldn't be, but because no one stopped it from tipping. Your warmth, once mutual, starts to feel directional, flowing outward more than it returns. Some people don't know how to give in the same way they take, not because they're selfish, but because they've learned to rest where resistance is low. When they meet someone who absorbs emotion without complaint, they settle there. They share more, they ask more, they expect more, often without realizing expectation is formed. You begin to sense an invisible agreement taking shape. You're the listener, you're the one who understands, you're the one who makes things easier. No one ever asked if you wanted that role. It just arrived, quietly, and stayed. What makes this difficult is that nothing feels intentionally wrong. There's no moment you can point to and say, this is where it changed. Instead, there's a slow accumulation of moments where you give without noticing the cost. You show up again and again because that's who you've been, because pulling back feels unfamiliar, because warmth has always felt safer than distance. Yet, somewhere inside, a subtle awareness grows. You notice how certain people come to you only when they need something, how some conversations never seem to turn back toward you, how your silence is accepted, but your absence would be questioned. You don't resent them, not really. You understand how it happened. You can trace it back to your own openness, your own willingness to hold space. That understanding makes it harder to blame anyone else. It also makes it harder to ignore yourself. The permission wasn't granted in a single moment. It was built through consistency, through showing up even when you were tired, through offering calm when you needed it yourself, through never asking for much in return. Over time, that consistency taught people what to expect from you, and expectations, once formed, are quiet but heavy. They don't announce themselves, they simply settle into place, shaping how others approach you. You feel them in the pauses, in the assumptions, in the way your availability is taken for granted rather than appreciated. You start to realize that warmth, left uncontained, doesn't always stay gentle. Sometimes it becomes a doorway. And once people walk through it enough times, they stop noticing the door at all. They just assume it will always be open, waiting, silent, ready to receive.
The cost doesn't arrive the way people expect it to. There's no collapse, no sharp moment where everything falls apart and demands your attention. Instead, it shows up as a quiet tiredness that doesn't fully go away. You sleep, but you don't feel rested. You take breaks, but something inside you remains slightly strained, like a muscle that never fully relaxes. You still function, you still show up, you still respond when people reach out. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. That's part of what makes it hard to explain, even to yourself. You don't feel burned out in the dramatic sense. You feel worn down in a softer, more confusing way. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from always being emotionally available, from always listening carefully, from always holding space, even when you don't have much space left inside. It's not overwhelming, it's constant. And because it's constant, it starts to feel normal. You notice it in small ways. Your patience runs thinner than it used to. Your attention drifts more easily. Conversations that once felt engaging now feel heavier than expected.
Not because the people are different, but because you're carrying more than you realize. You tell yourself this is just part of being mature, that everyone feels this way eventually. You assume it's the cost of being thoughtful, of being dependable. And maybe that's true, to a point. But there's a difference between responsibility and erosion. The erosion happens quietly. You don't lose your energy all at once, you lose it in pieces. A little less enthusiasm here, a little less curiosity there. You begin to protect yourself without fully knowing how. You withdraw slightly, then feel guilty for doing so. You offer less, then wonder why you feel distant. What hurts isn't that people rely on you, it's that your presence starts to feel like a resource rather than a person. You sense it when conversations begin with needs instead of curiosity, when your role is assumed before you speak, when your value seems tied to how much you can absorb without complaint. No one says this out loud. That's the part that makes it feel unreal. But you feel it in how interactions unfold, in how rarely someone asks how you are and truly waits for the answer, in how easily your boundaries blur because they were never clearly drawn to begin with. You don't feel angry about it. Anger would be easier. Anger would give you something to push against. What you feel instead is a quiet sadness, mixed with understanding. You see how it happened. You know you allowed it. That awareness keeps you gentle, but it also keeps you stuck. Nothing exploded, nothing forced a reckoning, and that's exactly why it continued. When loss is loud, it demands response. When it's quiet, it just becomes part of the background. You adapt to it without realizing you're adapting at all. Over time, you begin to miss yourself in subtle ways. Not a version of you from the past, but a certain lightness, a sense of ease you can't quite locate anymore. You wonder when interactions started to feel like something you manage rather than something you enter freely. This isn't about blame, not toward others and not toward yourself. It's about noticing the shape of what's happening, about recognizing that staying open indefinitely has a cost, even when your intentions are good. You don't need to dramatize it. You don't need to label it. You just need to acknowledge that something has been slowly taken from you. Not stolen, not demanded, just worn away through use. That realization doesn't arrive with panic, it arrives with clarity. A calm, steady understanding that what feels like exhaustion isn't weakness, it's information. It's your system quietly signaling that something needs to change, not urgently, not aggressively, but honestly. You sit with that awareness for a moment. You let it settle without trying to fix it yet, because simply seeing the cost, clearly and without judgment, is the first time it stops happening in the dark. At some point, the word cold begins to surface in your thoughts, not sharply, not as an accusation, more as a question. You wonder if pulling back, even slightly, would make you distant, unkind, or unrecognizable to yourself. You've seen what true coldness looks like in others, and you don't want to become that. You don't want to harden. You don't want to shut down. But what you're feeling drawn toward isn't hardness, it's containment. There is a difference between being cold and being contained, though they can look similar from the outside. Coldness rejects. Containment holds. Coldness pushes away. Containment simply doesn't spill. You begin to sense that what you need isn't less feeling, but fewer leaks, less constant exposure, less emotional output without recovery. You notice how often you've equated warmth with goodness and distance with failure, how quickly you assume that if you're not offering something, you're withholding. That belief has shaped your behavior for a long time. It's why you explain yourself even when no explanation is required, why you soften truths before they're spoken, why you stay open long after your energy has quietly asked you to close the door. What if restraint isn't cruelty? What if it's care directed inward for once? When you imagine being emotionally colder, what you're really imagining is silence where there used to be justification, a pause where there used to be reassurance, a stillness where there used to be emotional labor. That stillness feels unfamiliar, even threatening, because it removes a role you've played for a long time. You've been the one who makes things easier, the one who smooths edges, the one who absorbs tension so others don't have to feel it. Stepping back from that doesn't make you less human. It simply means you stop translating yourself for everyone else. Something subtle changes when you stop explaining your inner world in real time. Conversations slow down. People listen differently. Some lean in with more care. Others drift away without comment. You don't chase either response. You just notice that your presence no longer requires constant maintenance. There's a quiet strength in not filling every silence, in not clarifying every emotion, in letting people sit with their own interpretations rather than rushing to correct them. That strength isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just holds its shape. What surprises you is how peaceful this begins to feel. Not immediately, but gradually. Your thoughts settle faster. Your body feels less braced. You're no longer scanning interactions for moments where you need to adjust or repair something. You're simply there. From the outside, this might look like distance, like coldness, but inside, it feels like alignment, like finally standing at the center of yourself instead of leaning outward all the time. You're not withholding care, you're just no longer offering it by default. You're allowing it to emerge naturally, in moments where it's shared rather than taken. That distinction changes everything. The silence you create isn't empty, it's protective. It gives your emotions a place to rest instead of perform. It allows you to feel without broadcasting, to care without carrying. You begin to understand that warmth doesn't disappear when you contain it. It becomes more intentional, more precise. It stops being something others can access at will and starts becoming something that's shared when it's truly mutual. This isn't about becoming unreachable. It's about becoming whole, about letting your emotions belong to you again instead of living halfway outside your own boundaries. As this understanding settles in, there's no rush to act on it, no dramatic shift required. Just a quiet reorientation, a sense that what once felt like coldness is actually calm, and calm, you realize, has been missing for a long time. When you begin to give a little less, something interesting happens. Not all at once, and not in a way that draws attention. The world doesn't react dramatically. People don't confront you. There are no announcements or explanations required. Instead, there's a subtle rearranging, a quiet sorting that happens on its own. Some people remain exactly as they were. They adjust without comment. They don't demand the version of you that was always available. They meet you where you are now, without confusion or resistance. Being around them feels easier than before, not because you're doing more, but because you're doing less. Others fade, slowly, gently. Their messages become shorter, their presence less frequent. You notice it, but it doesn't sting the way you expected it to. There's no sharp sense of loss, just an understanding. These connections were built on access, not closeness, on availability, not depth. When the access changes, the connection naturally loosens. What surprises you most is how little effort this sorting requires from you. You're not cutting anyone off. You're not drawing lines or making statements. You're simply no longer filling every space. And in that absence, people reveal how they relate to you without you having to ask. There's a quiet relief in this, not because fewer people means better people, but because the energy exchange begins to feel cleaner. You're no longer carrying relationships on your own. You're no longer wondering what you owe. The weight you've been holding starts to dissolve, piece by piece. Respect begins to feel different too, less fragile, less dependent on constant reassurance. When you stop managing how you're perceived, something steadier takes its place. People listen without you needing to emphasize. They pause without you needing to insist. Not because you've become colder, but because you've become clearer. You notice how little you have to explain now, how rarely you feel the urge to justify your tone, your timing, your boundaries. Silence does more work for you than words ever did. And that silence doesn't feel empty. It feels grounded. It feels earned. There's a sense of calm that settles in once you stop proving your value through emotional labor. You no longer feel responsible for how others interpret your distance. You don't rush to close gaps that aren't yours to close. You let people meet you, or not, without chasing either outcome. This calm isn't dramatic.
It doesn't come with confident speeches or bold declarations. It shows up as steadiness, as ease, as the ability to sit with yourself without feeling the need to reach outward. You begin to trust that what's meant to stay will stay without effort. Nothing about you has become harsher. If anything, you're softer inside. There's more room to feel without being pulled in every direction, more space to rest between interactions, more clarity about what belongs to you and what doesn't. You realize that emotional coldness was never the goal. Emotional sovereignty was. The ability to feel deeply without being drained, to care without being consumed, to connect without disappearing into the connection. As the night grows quieter, this understanding doesn't demand action. It simply settles. You breathe a little slower. Your thoughts move with less urgency. There's nothing you need to fix, nothing you need to prepare for tomorrow. You're allowed to exist without offering yourself constantly. You're allowed to be present without being available. And in that permission, you feel something rare and steady. Peace. Not the kind that comes from isolation, but the kind that comes from balance, from finally standing where you are, fully, without leaning too far in any direction. You remain there, calm and contained, letting the quiet hold you.